Chapter 2. Once in his chilly bedroom, he realized that his upper mind had permitted him to do a foolish thing. He had drifted, like a schoolboy, into an unwise situation. He had pledged himself to an expedition with two strangers, an expedition for which normally he would have chosen his companions with the utmost caution. Moreover, he was guide. They looked to him for safety, while yet it was they who had arranged and planned it. But who were these men with whom he proposed to run grave bodily risks? He knew them as little as they knew him. Whence came, he wondered, the curious idea that this climb was really planned by another who was not one of them? The thought slipped idly across his mind. Going out by one door, it came back, however, quickly by another. He did not think about it more than to note its passage through the disorder that passed with him just then for thinking. Indeed, there was nothing in the whole world for which he cared a single brass farthing. As he undressed for bed, he said to himself, "I shall be called at 1. But why am I going with these two on this wild plan? And who made the plan?" It seemed to have settled itself. It came about so naturally and easily, so quickly. He probed no deeper. He didn't care. And for the first time he omitted the little ritual half-prayer, half-adoration it had always been his custom to offer to his deities upon retiring to rest. He no longer recognized them. How utterly broken his life was, how blank and terrible and lonely. He felt cold, and piled his overcoats upon the bed, as though his mental isolation involved a physical effect as well. Switching off the light by the door, he was in the act of crossing the floor in the darkness when a sound beneath the window caught his ear. Outside there were voices talking. The roar of falling water made them indistinct, yet he was sure they were voices, and that one of them he knew. He stopped still to listen. He heard his own name uttered, John Lemison. They ceased. He stood a moment, shivering on the boards, then crawled into bed beneath the heavy clothing. But in the act of settling down, they began again. He raised himself again hurriedly to listen. What little wind there was passed in that moment down the valley, carrying off the roar of falling water, and into the moment's space of silence dropped fragments of definite sentences. "They are close, you say, close down upon the world." It was the voice of the priest, surely. "For days they have been passing," was the answer, a rough, deep tone that might have been a peasant's, and a kind of fear in it. "For all my flocks are scattered." "The signs are sure, you know them." "Tumult," was the answer in much lower tones. "There has been tumult in the mountains." There was a break then, as though the voices sank too low to be heard. Two broken fragments came next. End of a question, beginning of an answer. "The opportunity of a lifetime." "If he goes of his own free will, success is sure, for acceptance is." And the wind, returning, bore back the sound of the falling water, so that Lemison heard no more. An indefinable emotion stirred in him as he turned over to sleep. He stuffed his ears lest he should hear more. He was aware of a sinking of the heart that was inexplicable. What in the world were they talking about, these two? What was the meaning of these disjointed phrases? There lay behind them a grave significance, almost solemn. That tumult in the mountains was somehow ominous, its suggestion terrible and mighty. He felt disturbed, uncomfortable, the first emotion that had stirred in him for days. The numbness melted before its faint awakening. Conscience was in it. He felt vague prickings, but it was deeper far than conscience. Somewhere out of sight, in a region life had not yet plumbed, the words sank down and vibrated like pedal notes. They rumbled away into the night of undecipherable things, and though explanation failed him, he felt they had reference somehow to the morrow's expedition. How, what, wherefore, he knew not. His name had been spoken, then these curious sentences. That was all. Yet tomorrow's expedition, what was it but an expedition of impersonal kind, not even planned by himself? Merely his own plan taken and altered by others, made over. His personal business, his personal life, were not really in it at all. The thought startled him a moment. He had no personal life. Struggling with sleep, his brain played the endless game of disentanglement without winning a single point, while the undermined in him looked on and smiled, because it knew. Then, suddenly, a great peace fell over him. Exhaustion brought it, perhaps. He fell asleep, and next moment, it seemed, he was aware of a thundering at the door and an unwelcome growling voice. "'Sist bald ein Ohr, Herr! Aufstehen!" Rising at such an hour, unless the heart be in it, is a sordid and depressing business. Lemeson dressed without enthusiasm, conscious that thought and feeling were exactly where he had left them on going to sleep. The same confusion and bewilderment were in him. Also, the same deep, solemn emotion stirred by the whispering voices. Only long habit enabled him to attend to detail, and ensured that nothing was forgotten. He felt heavy and oppressed, a kind of anxiety about him. The routine of preparation he followed gravely, utterly untouched by the customary joy. It was mechanical. Yet through it ran the old familiar sense of ritual, due to the practice of so many years, that cleansing of mind and body for a big ascent, like initiatory rites that once had been as important to him as those of some priest who approached the worship of his deity in the temples of ancient time. He performed the ceremony with the same care as though no ghost of vanished faith still watched him, beckoning from the air as formerly. His knapsack carefully packed, he took his ice axe from beside the bed, turned out the light, and went down the creaking wooden stairs in stockinged feet, lest his heavy boots should waken the other sleepers. And in his head still rang the phrase he had fallen asleep on, as though just uttered. "The signs are sure. For days they have been passing, close down upon the world. The flocks are scattered. There has been tumult in the mountains." The other fragments he had forgotten, but who were they, and why did the word bring a chill of awe into his blood? And as the words rolled through him, Lemeson felt tumult in his thoughts and feelings too. There had been tumult in his life, and all his joys were scattered, joys that hitherto had fed his days. The signs were sure. Something was close down upon his little world, passing, sweeping. He felt a touch of terror. Outside, in the fresh darkness of very early morning, the strangers stood waiting for him. Rather, they seemed to arrive in the same instant as himself, equally punctual. The clock in the church tower sounded 1. They exchanged low greetings, remarked that the weather promised to hold good, and started off in single file over soaking meadows towards the first belt of forest. The porter, mere peasant, unfamiliar of face and not connected with the hotel, led the way with a hurricane lantern. The air was marvelously sweet and fragrant. In the sky overhead, the stars shone in their thousands. Only the noise of falling water from the heights and the regular thud of their heavy boots broke the stillness. And, black against the sky, towered the enormous pyramid of the Tour de Neon they meant to conquer. Perhaps the most delightful portion of a big ascent is the beginning, in the scented darkness, while the thrill of possible conquest lies still far off. The hours stretch themselves queerly. Last night's sunset might be days ago. Sunrise and the brilliance coming seem in another week. part of dim futurity like children's holidays. It is difficult to realize that this biting cold before the dawn and the blazing heat to come both belong to the same today. There were no sounds as they toiled slowly up the zigzag path through the first 1,500 feet of pine woods. No one spoke. The clink of nails and ice axe points against the stones was all they heard, for the roar of water was felt rather than heard. It beat against the ears and the skin of the whole body at once. The deeper notes were below them now in the sleeping valley. The shriller ones sounded far above, where streams just born out of ponderous snowbeds tinkled sharply. The change came delicately. The stars turned a shade less brilliant, a softness in them as of human eyes that say farewell. Between the highest branches the sky grew visible. A sighing air smoothed all their crests one way. Moss, earth, and open spaces brought keen perfumes, and the little human procession, leaving the forest, stepped out into the vastness of the world above the tree line. They paused while the porter stooped to put his lantern out. In the eastern sky was color. The peaks and crags rushed closer. Was it the dawn? Limousin turned his eyes from the height of sky, where the summits pierced a path for the coming day, to the faces of his companions, pale and wan in the early twilight. How small, how insignificant they seemed amid this hungry emptiness of desolation. The stupendous cliffs fled past them, led by headstrong peaks crowned with eternal snows. Thin lines of cloud, trailing halfway up precipice and ridge, seemed like the swish of movement, as though he caught the earth turning as she raced through space. The four of them, timid riders on the gigantic saddle, clung for their lives against her tightened ribs, while currents of some majestic life swept up at them from every side. He drew deep draughts of the rarefied air into his lungs. It was very cold. Avoiding the pallid, insignificant faces of his companions, he pretended interest in the porter's operations. He stared fixedly on the ground. It seemed 20 minutes before the flame was extinguished, and the lantern fastened to the pack behind. This dawn was unlike any he had seen before. For, in reality, all the while, Limousin was trying to bring order out of the extraordinary thoughts and feelings that had possessed him during the slow forest ascent, and the task was not crowned with much success. The plan, made by others, had taken charge of him, he felt, and he had thrown the reins of personal will and interest loosely upon its steady gait. He had abandoned himself carelessly to what might come. Knowing that he was leader of the expedition, he yet had suffered the porter to go first, taking his own place as it was appointed to him, behind the younger man, but before the priest. In this order they had plodded as only experienced climbers plod, 4 hours without a rest, until halfway up a change had taken place. He had wished it, and instantly it was effected. The priest moved past him, while his companion dropped to the rear. The companion, who forever stumbled in his speed, whereas the older man climbed surely, confidently. And thereafter Limousin walked more easily, as though the relative positions of the three were of importance somehow. The steep ascent of smothering darkness through the woods became less arduous. He was glad to have the younger man behind him, for the impression had strengthened as they climbed in silence that this ascent pertained to some significant ceremony, and the idea had grown insistently, almost stealthily, upon him. The movements of himself and his companions, especially the positions each occupied relatively to the other, established some kind of intimacy that resembled speech, suggesting even question and answer. And the entire performance, while occupying hours by his watch, it seemed to him more than once, had been in reality briefer than the flash of a passing thought, so that he saw it within himself, pictorially. He thought of a picture worked in colors upon a strip of elastic. Someone pulled the strip and the picture stretched, or someone released it again and the picture flew back, reduced to a mere stationary speck. All happened in a single speck of time. And the little change of position, apparently so trivial, gave point to this singular notion working in his undermind, that this ascent was a ritual and a ceremony, as in older days, its significance approaching revelation, however, for the first time now. Without language, this stole over him. No words could quite describe it, for it came to him that these three formed a unit, himself being in some fashion yet the acknowledged principal, the leader. The laboring porter had no place in it, for this first toiling through the darkness was a preparation, and when the actual climb began, he would disappear, while Limousin himself went first. This idea that they took part together in a ceremony established itself firmly in him, with the added wonder that, though so often done, he performed it now for the first time, with full comprehension, knowledge, truth. Empty of personal desire, indifferent to an ascent that formerly would have thrilled his heart with ambition and delight, he understood that climbing had ever been a ritual for his soul and of his soul, and that power must result from its sincere accomplishment. It was a symbolical ascent. In words, this did not come to him. He felt it, never criticizing. That is, he neither rejected nor accepted. It stole most sweetly, grandly, over him. It floated into him while he climbed, yet so convincingly that he had felt his relative position must be changed. The younger man held too prominent a post, or at least a wrong one, in advance. Then, after the change, effected mysteriously as though all recognized it, this line of certainty increased, and there came upon him a big, strange knowledge that all life is a ceremony on a giant scale, and that by performing the movements accurately, with sincere fidelity, there may come knowledge. There was gravity in him from that moment. This ran in his mind with certainty. Though his thought assumed no form of little phrases, his brain yet furnished detailed statements that clinched the marvelous thing with simile and incident which daily life might apprehend. That knowledge arises from action, that to do the thing invites the teaching and explains it. Action, moreover, is symbolical. A group of men, a family, an entire nation, engaged in those daily movements which are the working out of their destiny, perform a ceremony which is in direct relation somewhere to the pattern of greater happenings which are the teachings of the gods. Let the body imitate, reproduce, in a bedroom, in a wood, anywhere, the movements of the stars, and the meaning of those stars shall sink down into the heart. The movements constitute a script, a language. To mimic the gestures of a stranger is to understand his mood, his point of view, to establish a grave and solemn intimacy. Temples are everywhere, for the entire earth is a temple, and the body, house of royalty, is the biggest temple of them all. To ascertain the pattern its movements trace in daily life could be to determine the relation of that particular ceremony to the cosmos, and so learn power. The entire system of Pythagoras, he realized, could be taught without a single word, by movements, and in everyday life, even the commonest act and vulgarest movement are part of some big ceremony, a message from the gods. Ceremony, in a word, is three-dimensional language, and action, therefore, is the language of the gods. The gods he had denied were speaking to him, passing with tumult close across his broken life. Their passage it was, indeed, that had caused the breaking. In this cryptic, condensed fashion, the great fact came over him, that he and these other two, here and now, took part in some great ceremony of whose ultimate object as yet he was in ignorance. The impact with which it dropped upon his mind was tremendous. He realized it most fully when he stepped from the darkness of the forest and entered the expanse of glimmering early light. Up till this moment his mind was being prepared only, whereas now he knew. The innate desire to worship, which all along had been his, the momentum his religious temperament had acquired during 40 years, the yearning to have proof, in a word, that the gods he once acknowledged were really true, swept back upon him with that violent reaction which denial had aroused. He wavered where he stood. Looking about him, then, while the others rearranged burdens, the returning porter now discarded, he perceived the astonishing beauty of the time and place, feeling it soak into him as by the very pores of his skin. From all sides this beauty rushed upon him. Some radiant, winged sense of wonder sped past him through the silent air. A thrill of ecstasy ran down every nerve. The hair of his head stood up. It was far from unfamiliar to him, this sight of the upper mountain world awakening from its sleep of the summer night, but never before had he stood shuddering thus at its exquisite cold glory, nor felt its significance as now, so mysteriously within himself. Some transcendent power that held sublimity was passing across this huge, desolate plateau, far more majestic than the mere sunrise among the mountains he had so often witnessed. There was movement. He understood why he had seen his companions insignificant. Again he shivered and looked about him, touched by a solemnity that held deep awe. Personal life, indeed, was wrecked, destroyed, but something greater was on the way. His fragile alliance with the spiritual world was strengthened. He realized his own past insolence. He became afraid.